Thanks, Salil, for not telling any of the embarrassing stories. I appreciate that. So thanks, everyone, for coming. So in this talk, I'm going to kind of survey some of the work I've been doing on privacy-preserving data analysis. And I want to start by just sort of giving like my sense of kind of what the field is about. By the way, can everyone hear me? Not too loud? Two microphones, right. So I'm very amplified. OK, so what is privacy-preserving data analysis all about? I think it comes as no surprise that we're collecting data from more sources than ever before, more widely than ever before. It comes from medical records, your online behavior, social networks, the US Census, genetic sequencing, all kinds of sources. And this is great. It lets us do all kinds of interesting research that we couldn't do before. But a lot of this data is collected in a somewhat invasive way, and it can contain a lot of very sensitive information about you. So what we'd really like is a way to simultaneously allow for kind of statistical analysis of this data without compromising privacy for the individuals in the data set. All right, that's sort of the whole question we want to answer. And first, let me just give you some examples of why it can be challenging to strike a good balance between these two. So the first thing you might try to do is just take the data set and kind of strip off sort of obvious information that identifies individuals. So here's my database of which Woody Allen movies everyone has watched, and maybe I just take the names off of it. And I get some sort of anonymized data set. And I can still do statistics on this data set, but I can't obviously tell anything about a specific person. But we actually see sort of repeatedly in practice that there are ways of combining these anonymized data sets with various forms of side information about people in such a way that you can actually learn a lot about the specific individuals. So maybe I know something about which movies Alice watched. I can tell this is Alice's record. And now I learned something new about Alice I couldn't tell before. This is just a toy example, but it can be really challenging to figure out how to produce these anonymized data sets in a robust way. Another thing you might try to do is just release some kind of aggregate statistics about the data set. So maybe I don't even release a table where nothing that I release corresponds to a specific person. And even here, it's a little harder to show a specific example, but it's known that if you release enough statistics about the data set, there are actually ways to reconstruct the data set and learn a lot about individuals. And we even see this in practice. There was a paper that did this for genomics data. So it can be really challenging to decide what is really safe to release. And what would be great would be if we had kind of a formal provable privacy guarantee that was robust to these kinds of attacks, so robust to these kind of side information attacks or composition attacks, but still allowed for statistical analysis of the data. All right, this is what we'd really like. And I think there's a lot of hope that differential privacy can actually be such a definition, or such a privacy model. So in a second, I'm going to tell you formally what differential privacy is, but I want to just say what the intuition it's supposed to capture is. An algorithm is going to be differentially private if there's no attacker, regardless of side information that they hold, that can learn much more about any individual in the data set than they could if that individual weren't even in the data set. All right, that's sort of almost the ideal privacy guarantee I could give you. And it's in sort of direct contrast to the attacks that I gave you examples of a minute ago. All right, so this is the intuition I want to formalize. I want to give kind of a strong privacy guarantee like this. And let me say kind of how you formalize it. All right, so to formalize it, I'm going to introduce two databases. You can think of D as sort of the real database, and D prime as kind of the database minus your data. I've pulled everything about you out of the data set. And I want to run some algorithm. And I want the algorithm to mask which of these two data sets is the real input. All right? And what I mean by that is I'm going to have the algorithm inject some kind of random noise into its output in such a way that it hides any one row of the database. So if I view the output of A of D as a distribution, and I view A of D prime as a distribution, these two distributions should be close. All right? And if they're close, the adversary really can't get any more information out of A of D than they could out of A of D prime. And A of D prime doesn't contain your data. All right? And so differential privacy says this should hold for every pair of databases that differ on one row. So any one person in the database should be protected in this way. And it's a quantitative definition. So it says these distributions should be close in a very particular way. And what that measure of closeness is, I introduce a parameter epsilon. This is sort of like the level of privacy. And I say that for every event S defined on the range of the algorithm, so think of S as kind of some set of bad outputs that I don't want my algorithm to give me, the probability of those bad outputs on the real database should be not much larger than it would be if I had removed my data completely. Okay, and by not much larger, I mean that it can increase by a multiplicative factor of 1 plus epsilon for some small epsilon, like say 1 in 100. All right, so this is epsilon differential privacy. Often we allow a small additional fudge factor, but I think this captures enough of what the definition is trying to achieve to make the point. And I'm not really going to talk anymore about the formal definition. I just want you to sort of keep the intuition in mind for what differential privacy is trying to do. All right, so again, just going back to the intuition, we have a provable guarantee. So it's a formal guarantee that if I can achieve it, if my algorithm is differentially private, then it's going to be robust to side information. It's going to kind of degrade gracefully under composition. So you'll see statements like, if I run 2 epsilon differentially private algorithms, the result will satisfy 2 epsilon differential privacy. I can quantify how privacy degrades after multiple uses. And the question is, does this allow for interesting statistical analysis of the data? All right, so this is a great definition to achieve. What can I do with it? And let me give you an example, sort of the classic example of a differentially private algorithm. So I have some data set D. It's very simple. It only gives me 1 bit of information about each person. And there's n people in the database. And I just want to know the mean. I just want to know what fraction of people watched Annie Hall. What fraction of people answered yes to this question. So what I can do is I can have my algorithm write down the exact answer. So write down, in this case, 0.75, and then just perturb the answer with some kind of random noise. And the noise is going to hide the contribution of one individual's data to the answer. And intuitively, in order to hide one individual's data, I need to add noise whose magnitude is about 1 in n. All right, so I'm not going to go through the proof, but intuitively, changing one person's data can only change the answer by 1 in n, so this should be enough noise to hide their contribution. And I want you to notice something that's very common in differential privacy. As the amount of data I have gets larger, as n goes to infinity, the amount of error I'm adding is actually going to 0. All right, so if I have enough data, I'm getting a very accurate answer. All right, so let's do something a little more complicated. Suppose now I have D attributes per record. So I have a very high-dimensional data set where everyone has given me not just 1 bit of information, but D bits of information. And using kind of the composability of differential privacy, you can actually show that it's sufficient to still add noise to each answer, but just add a little more noise. So the amount of noise you have to add is going to be about the square root of the dimension over n. All right, so again, just by adding noise, I can actually give accurate answers as long as I have enough data. Okay, and so I think this also highlights something that's typical in differentially private algorithms, which is that the amount of data I need is going to be growing with the dimension. And this is actually one of the kind of central themes of the work I'm doing. All right, so these are just some very simple examples of differentially private algorithms. I think they're sort of the canonical ones. But there's actually a very rich space of differentially private algorithms. There's algorithms for all kinds of problems that look nothing like answering these means or counts, and algorithms that are much more complicated than just directly perturbing the output. So there's a big set of algorithms for differential privacy, and it's a rapidly expanding space. And there's lots of interesting questions we want to know about differentially private algorithm design. OK, so all right, so I said we're getting a very strong privacy guarantee. It's a very robust, kind of flexible guarantee. But it seems to come with some price, which is that often I actually need a lot of data. So if I have a lot of data, the error will go to 0. But sometimes I really need a lot of data. And that can be expensive. We don't always have a lot of data. And so we want to know, what is the price of differential privacy? Is this a limitation of the algorithms we have now, or is this just a fundamental trade-off that we have to suffer through to get privacy-preserving data analysis. And this is really like the main kind of motivating question underlying all of the work in differential privacy, I think. So basically, what you want to know is what analyses are compatible with privacy, how much data do I need, and also how efficient can these algorithms be. So I haven't been able to give you an example, but it's very common that you actually need more data if you require the algorithm to be efficient. And this, I think, will come out in the work I'm going to present. All right, but this is sort of the main question that I want to understand is what is the price of differentially private data analysis? Do we have to make compromises, or can we get differential privacy? And so I kind of work on this problem from two angles. So the first thing that I'm going to present in the talk is some kind of nearly optimal lower bounds on the amount of data you need to achieve differential privacy. And as I said, I'm sort of particularly interested in how the amount of data you need depends on the dimension of the data. All right, so lower bounds are going to be sort of a big part of the talk. They're going to take two flavors. They're going to be either information theoretic lower bounds. These are kind of arguments that apply to any algorithm, regardless of its running time. And also some kind of even stronger lower bounds that will apply to computationally efficient algorithms. And I've been telling you that I think differential privacy has like sort of all this promise for balancing privacy and utility in analyzing sensitive data. So why am I talking about lower bounds? And I think Cynthia Dwork gave a very good sort of argument for this that she calls the power of negative thinking. And that these lower bounds are important for sort of setting our expectations, delineating what can be achieved, and also for informing algorithm design. So differential privacy itself actually was a response to attacks. So sort of the first papers that are considered part of differential privacy were actually negative results for privacy. And I think we see that by really understanding what's hard about the problem, it really points us towards good solutions. OK, so this is kind of approaching the problem from lower bounds. And I also do a lot of work trying to design kind of efficient algorithms for various natural tasks that come up in privacy-preserving data analysis. So if you sort of pick your favorite task, you can try to figure out directly what is the best algorithm for that task. And I've worked on this in a number of problems. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the contingency table specifically later in the talk. All right, so this is just kind of an overview of what I think this area is all about. And now let me get into sort of the meat of the talk. So I'm going to present sort of two kind of lines of work. So the first, which is going to be the larger part of the talk, is on something called fingerprinting codes, which I'll tell you about, and how fingerprinting codes can be used to really sort of sharpen our understanding of the price of differential privacy in fairly general settings. And then kind of in the second and shorter part of the talk, I'm going to give an example of a problem where we can actually get more efficient algorithms. We can get algorithms where we pay a lower price for differential privacy by exploiting kind of some simple special cases that are interesting in practice. All right. And please feel free to stop me for questions at any point. If anyone has any questions about sort of the motivation or the background, this would be a good time. All right, so I'm going to get into part one of the talk. So this part of the talk is going to be about kind of how we get nearly optimal lower bounds for some natural problems that come up in differential privacy. And I'm going to introduce most of the main ideas by just looking at a very simple problem, one that I've already introduced, which is computing the mean of a high-dimensional data set. All right, so again, I have this database where each person in the database answered D yes or no questions. In this case, they told me whether they did or didn't watch each of these D movies. And I want to know for each movie what fraction of people watch the movie. All right, very simple problem. I hope it's clear. And I already told you that if the way you solve the problem is by adding just independent noise to each of the answers, you need to add noise whose magnitude is about the square root of d over n. OK? And what you should notice is that if the amount of data I have is smaller than square root d, this noise is going to be bigger than 1. The answers range between 0 and 1. This is meaningless. OK? So if I have less than square root of d records, I can't get anything using this algorithm. And I want to know if I can do better. And first I want to put this answer in some context. Why would I even want to do better than root d? That maybe that's not that much. So let's think about where kind of this data is coming from. So often what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to learn about the population as a whole. What I really want to know is what fraction of the population watch these movies. And what I've done is I've sampled random people from the population, and I'm going to use the sample as a proxy. And to do that, I need to collect some non-trivial amount of data, even ignoring privacy. But if all I want to do is ensure that the population means and the sample means are close, it's actually sufficient to take log d samples. All right, so if I was just trying to do statistics, I would probably collect about log d people in my database. However, if then you don't just want statistics, you want differential privacy, now I'm telling you that you need square root of d people in your database. This is exponentially larger. All right, so using this algorithm seems to incur a big price. And we want to know, is this inherent? So as I said, there are lots of algorithms for solving this type of problem in differential privacy that are more sophisticated. They don't seem to help for this problem. And on the negative side, the best lower bound only seems to tell us that we need log d people in the data set to get differential privacy. But you probably already had log d people in the data set. So what I really want to know is there a price? Do I need more than log d people to get differential privacy and compute the attribute means of the data set? And it turns out the answer is yes. All right, so this is a result from work with Mark Bunn and Salil Vadan, where we showed that any differentially private algorithm that can accurately estimate the d attribute means of a data set requires about square root of d records. All right, so this is the result. It shows that the simple approach where I add noise to each attribute mean is nearly optimal. Whoops. OK, and qualitatively, what this result shows is not just a bound of root d, but it shows that there can actually be a significant price of getting differential privacy if I want to analyze a high-dimensional data set. All right, so it says I need more data than I would have needed just to guarantee kind of statistical accuracy of the data set. And there are various reasons why other techniques can't show this. So this is really like one of the first cases where we can prove this for general differentially private algorithms. And the method, I think, is very interesting. We show a connection between differential privacy and something called a fingerprinting code. All right, and these fingerprinting codes were introduced by Bonnet and Shaw in 1995 for problems in cryptography, essentially. And yet we show that it's connected to differential privacy. OK, so let me show you what the connection is. And to do that, I need to tell you what a fingerprinting code is. So let's suppose that you have filmed a movie. All right, the motivating example for a fingerprinting code has nothing to do with privacy. You filmed a movie, and you want to give out a preview of your movie to these critics so that they can write reviews and drum up excitement about your movie. But you don't trust them. You're worried that they're going to take the movie and they're going to put it on their website, and now no one's going to see your movie. So what you might try to do is you might try to watermark the movie. You're going to give each one of them different versions. And then if it appears on the internet, you know which one of them has betrayed your trust. So what I might do is I might split the movie up into different scenes. Each scene will have 2 versions. And I'll give each one a different pattern of these dark blue and light blue versions of the scene. So if I do this, it's easy to see that if one person posts their movie, I can tell uniquely which one did it. The problem really is, what if a coalition of them get together and try to cheat me? All right, so many people get together, they scramble up their movies, put it on the internet, and now I don't know who did it. OK, but if I've designed my fingerprinting code, OK, so they put this scrambled version of the movie on the internet, and if I've designed my fingerprinting code correctly, then even this scrambled version will be traceable. I'll have an algorithm that can trace this back to one of the people in the coalition. All right, and hopefully this deters them from trying to cheat me. And kind of the magic here is that this should occur no matter who was in the coalition and no matter what they did. All right, so no matter what they do, as long as they put a movie that is actually my movie on the internet, I will be able to trace one of them. OK, and the fingerprinting code basically says, what pattern of watermarks do I put in my movie? All right, so the fingerprinting code itself has nothing to do with movies. What it tells me is, how should I distribute the scenes? So more formally, I'll have 2 algorithms, gen and trace. Gen is going to give me a matrix, all right? And think of the 1s and 0s as dark blue or light blue. And for each user, I get a d-bit string. There's n users, d-bits. And now I consider a subset of the rows. That's the coalition of users trying to cheat me. And I'll allow them to produce a new string, still of d-bits. And I require that for every column, they have to use one of the bits they hold in the column. So if you look at this first column, each of the users in the coalition had a 1, so they better put a 1 there. All right, and if you look at this fourth column, they both have zeros, so they better put a 0 there. And other than that, I don't care what they do. All right, and now I have my algorithm trace that's supposed to be able to take this string and always identify someone in this coalition. All right, so it's going to output some user I, and with high probability, I will be in the coalition. All right, and that's a fingerprinting code. And again, it's important that it should work no matter what this subset S is, no matter what the coalition is here, and no matter what they do, subject only to this constraint. All right. OK, so we got a little bit away from privacy for a second. What does this have to do with differential privacy? I claim that if you once you know about differential privacy and fingerprinting codes, and you think about it a little bit, you'll see that really these things are almost exactly the opposite of one another. So what I mean by that is that a differentially private algorithm is one that tells me some statistical properties of the data set, but in such a way that nobody can identify any specific record in the data set. And a fingerprinting code is a way of generating a data set such that if you preserve the statistical properties of the data set, then I can always identify a specific record. OK? So these things are really opposed. And this connection isn't completely new. Generally speaking, it's emerged in a series of recent works that there's a deep connection between differential privacy and these sort of content distribution systems. So this was actually first introduced in prior work by Dwork-Naor, Reingold, Rothblum, and Vedan, where they showed how to get computational hardness from something called a traitor tracing scheme. And then in sort of more recent work that I did, I showed how to combine traitor tracing schemes and fingerprinting codes to get kind of new computational hardness results. And then what we do in this more recent work is basically show that fingerprinting codes are kind of the main sort of combinatorial or information theoretic primitive that sort of underlies all the hardness of differential privacy. And so that's sort of what's new in this work, is that we get these information theoretic consequences. OK, so let me now just give you the proof of how, let me sketch more formally how these things are connected. So the theorem you can show is that if I have a fingerprinting code where there are n users in the system and their code words are length d, then any algorithm that can estimate the d attribute means of the data set requires n records. OK? So let's see how this works. This is my fingerprinting code. And let's suppose I had a differentially private algorithm that could estimate the attribute means of this data set. OK, so this is I take the coalition of users, I put each of their code words on a row, and now I want to estimate the attribute means of this data set. Well, if you look at a column where they have all ones, the attribute mean, the real attribute mean is 1. So any accurate estimate of the mean should be close to 1, which means if I round it, I'll get a 1. OK, so if I take the estimated attribute means and I round it, it's going to be a valid code word for the fingerprinting code. It's going to respect the constraints for the fingerprinting code. And that means that I can apply my tracing algorithm and I can identify somebody in this data set. OK? All right, now I haven't formally proven why this violates differential privacy, but intuitively, I'm learning something about the user that I wouldn't learn if they weren't in the data set. Precisely that they are in the data set. OK, so putting it together, if I have a fingerprinting code for n users, code words have length d, then I get a lower bound for differential privacy. And fortunately, kind of around the same time differential privacy was actually being discovered, Tardosh gave an optimal construction of fingerprinting codes, where if I'm allowed code words of length d, I can trace about root d users. And putting that together gives the result. OK, so once we have this connection, we can just pull fingerprinting codes off the shelf. But in fact, we actually do a little more than just pull fingerprinting codes off the shelf. So maybe you want to relax the guarantee so that instead of estimating the mean of each of the D attributes, I just estimate most of the attributes correctly. And to get a lower bound for that relaxed version of the problem, we need a fingerprinting code satisfying some notion of robustness. And people have considered these kind of robust fingerprinting codes before, but they don't have a strong enough robustness property for our purposes. So we actually went out and showed how to construct them. So there's kind of a two-way street between kind of interesting problems for fingerprinting codes and interesting questions in differential privacy. And we show how to sort of do a little more, both for fingerprinting codes and privacy, than was known before. OK, so this is sort of the story of computing the attribute means of the data set. And if there are no questions, I want to move on to a slightly more general problem that shows how we can do more with this fingerprinting code-based technique. But if there are questions, I'd be happy to field some. Yeah. Yeah. OK, so this is a fantastic question that Andrew asked. So for a fingerprinting code, what I know is I know the set of all the N code words I generated. OK? And I need that to trace. What I don't know is I don't know which of those N code words are in the database. Right? So maybe if I go back to the picture, I know this. What I don't know is which of these rows have been taken out of the database that I ran the algorithm on. And so that's the kind of privacy guarantee. That's the sort of privacy violation I'm getting. I sort of know your data, but what I don't know is, are you in the database or not? And that's the sensitive information that differential privacy says shouldn't be revealed. And so that's how you get a violation for differential privacy. All right, thanks. That was a really good question. OK, so I want to move on from attribute means and talk about a slightly more general problem and what kinds of things we can show about it. And the problem is one I call private statistical query release, and it just generalizes the case of attribute means. All right, so when I was talking about attribute means, what I really wanted was I wanted some algorithm that sort of kind of takes a set of queries and spits out a sequence of answers. And I want that for every query in my set big Q, the corresponding answer is close to the true answer. And the queries had a very simple form. They were like, what fraction of people watched the movie Zelig? So that would be an example on this database. But I can consider more general queries of this form, like just what fraction of records satisfy some property Q that I specify. OK, so maybe I have some set of attributes. I want to know what fraction of people watched either Annie Hall or Sleeper. And now I want an algorithm that takes a bunch of arbitrary statistical queries and gives appropriate answers. OK, so I have this more general statistical query release problem that I want to solve. It generalizes attribute means. And now I want to know what algorithms do I have for solving it. So first, I'm going to sort of plot them on a one-dimensional scale, just in terms of the amount of data that I need to give accurate answers to all my queries. OK, so the first thing you would do is additive noise. This just generalizes the case of attribute means. We didn't really use anything special about the fact that the queries were attribute means. And in general, if I want to ask a set of queries big Q, I need square root of the size of big Q records in my data set to get accurate answers. OK, but it turns out, so thanks to a really kind of elegant result of Blum, Liggett, and Roth from 2008, we actually know that exponentially less data suffices. OK, so the strongest results are actually achieved by a more recent algorithm called private multiplicative weights, which is what I put on the scale. But in general, there's been a long line of work showing that we can get away with much less data for this private query release problem. So in fact, we can use square root of d times log q. OK, exponentially less data. You might notice these are not comparable bounds, but I want to think of the set of queries as large, much larger than d. OK, and by combining fingerprinting codes with some other techniques, we're actually able to show that this bound of square root d log q is tight. This is the best you can do for answering an arbitrary family of statistical queries. OK, so on this axis, we're kind of at the end of the road, at least at this level of generality. But let me add another axis that makes the picture look a lot more complicated. And that axis is going to be the running time of the algorithm. OK, so first let's look at additive noise. Basically, the running time is just dominated by the time it takes to write down the answers to all the queries. OK, adding noise is very easy. On the other hand, what we'd really like to run is this private multiplicative weights algorithm because we could get away with a lot less data. But unfortunately, its running time is actually exponential in the dimensionality of the data. OK, again, these are incomparable bounds. Why do I put private multiplicative weights so much higher? And the reason is because typically I will think of the set of queries as smaller than 2 to the d. 2 to the d is a lot of queries. You probably don't have time to ask 2 to the d queries. OK, so this is exponential running time, even for kind of a modest number of simple queries. And I don't like that. And you might ask, can we get the best of both worlds? Can we get kind of the minimal amount of data that we know is necessary, but with running time, polynomial in the number of queries? And what I showed in work from last year is that you can't at this level of generality. If you want an algorithm that answers arbitrary statistical queries, these are sort of the best points you can get on the curve. OK, so this whole region is sort of unachievable. So here's kind of the statement in words. Any computationally efficient algorithm that answers an arbitrary set of statistical queries is going to have square root of n records in order to achieve accuracy. And this is a cryptographic result. So this is only true if you believe in secure cryptography. And you probably should believe that for reasons having nothing to do with this result. And on the technical side, the proof basically uses this connection I alluded to between traitor tracing schemes, which is sort of a cryptographic version of a fingerprinting code, but sort of combines traitor tracing schemes with fingerprinting codes in a novel way to get kind of a new traitor tracing scheme that is sort of tailored for proving this result. All right, so if you take sort of off-the-shelf traitor tracing schemes, you don't get this kind of thing. What was really exposed in this work is that you need to take sort of a more refined view of the connection between traitor tracing and differential privacy in order to get strong results like this. Yeah? Great question. So actually, what I just mean is, the answers range between 0 and 1. I just want to be able to tell you the answer to within, for this result, to within, say, a third. All right, so really, I just want to be able to distinguish between a true answer being 0 and a true answer being 1. So in some sense, pick your favorite constant. All right, you want the error to be smaller than that constant. Right, but it's still true, sort of in the limit as n goes to infinity, it will be bigger than root q. You can do lots of things. All right, so this is kind of all I wanted to say for part 1. I just want to summarize sort of the main take-home points from part 1, which is that fingerprinting codes are kind of an important tool for understanding what is the price of differentially private data analysis. Right, so they give sort of nearly optimal lower bounds for differentially private data analysis, and particularly they capture sort of the role that the dimensionality plays, either in the running time or in the amount of data you need. OK, but with that said, I want to move on to part 2, where I paint a slightly more optimistic picture, I hope, of what we can do with differential privacy. And what I want to talk about is how simple cases of this private statistical query release that are still useful for practice actually lead to more efficient algorithms, things we can't achieve in general. And I think this is an example of how, by having lower bounds that sort of illuminate the challenges where, for instance, we know for arbitrary statistical queries very little is achievable, this sort of points us to thinking about specific kinds of queries and how to harness their structure. So in particular, if for basically every kind of natural, simple family of queries we can think of, it's entirely possible that you can get sort of the best of both worlds in terms of data and running time. OK, so let me talk about, good Lord, one special family of queries that's relevant. Sorry, as you can tell, this is probably from a slightly older version of the slide where I rickrolled everyone in the audience. And the point is that I only care about nice properties Q. I don't care about sort of arbitrary, nasty properties that you might want to know about. I just care about simple things like what fraction of people watched Annie Hall or Sleeper. Okay, or more generally, I'll allow you to specify kind of K constraints. You can say what fraction of people satisfy any of K attributes. One of any set of K attributes. And that's a K-way disjunction. Okay, and I just want an algorithm that answers the K-way disjunction queries accurately. All right, so why do I care about such a simple family of queries? Well, of course, disjunctions are one of the simplest models of computation, so it's a natural starting point for theory. But it turns out that these are surprisingly useful. So basically, what I'm capturing here is I'm capturing the marginal distribution on small subsets of attributes. Okay, so things like two-way disjunctions basically correspond to correlations between attributes. And it's also equivalent to something called a contingency table, which I'm not going to define, but you may have heard of. It's a very commonly used form of data release by the Census Bureau. It's very popular in statistics. And so disjunction queries actually tell us a lot about the data set. So it'd be great if we could just solve this special case of statistical query release. And let me tell you what we can do. So here are kind of generic solutions for the problem, generic algorithms that work for any set of queries. And for disjunction queries, if I have k-way disjunctions, the number of queries is d choose k. So I'll just write that as d to the k. So I can specialize these results to this case. And let me just tell you kind of the main things that you should know. So I want you to think of k as small, like a constant, so 10. All right, so additive noise requires a polynomial amount of data, but a big one. All right, so d to the k. The running time is also polynomial. If k is a constant, d to the k. On the other hand, I could hope to use a lot less data, okay, something polynomial in d and k. And I can get it using private multiplicative weights, but I have to run an exponential time even when k is small. So even when there's just d squared two-way disjunction queries, I need exponential time. But as far as we know, it's entirely possible that I could have an algorithm that takes a database of this kind of optimal size, k root d, runs in time even sublinear in the number of queries, and outputs some kind of summary that lets me answer any k-way disjunction. All right, so none of the hardness results I told you about preclude this possibility. And this is where we'd really like to get. And we don't quite know how to get there, but we know some things that won't work, and we know some things that make a good start. So first of all, most algorithms, so algorithms like private multiplicative weights, the ones that have good data complexity, usually output something called a synthetic database. I won't quite tell you what that is, but intuitively, they just output a new database that looks like the original database. And in work with Sullivan, we were able to show that that sort of approach can't lead to an efficient algorithm. So it's hard to generate a synthetic database. So we want to look for ways to get past yet another barrier that don't involve synthetic data. And one approach that's actually been kind of given us some kind of encouraging preliminary results is to use a connection with learning theory. Okay, so what do I mean by this? So usually you think of queries as functions of the data. All right, that's sort of the way they're defined. That's the logical way to think of them. What I want you to think about is the database as a function. Okay, the database defines some function that takes a query and spits out the answer to that query on that database. And in general, this function can be very nasty. But the hope is that if the set of queries you care about is simple, then this function may be simple in some useful way. And in particular, it may admit a learning algorithm. All right, there's lots of ways to define a learning algorithm, but intuitively, it's one that I show you the evaluation of the function on a small number of points, and you can now output an approximation to the function that gives you approximately the correct answer on all points. Okay, and that's good for privacy because it means that if I show you the answer to a small number of queries, you can answer all the remaining queries. Okay, so intuitively, I don't need to touch my data as much. And we first introduced this approach in joint work with Gupta, Hart, and Roth from 2011. And initially, what we were able to use it for was to give sort of average case error guarantees, things that are weaker than what we want. In a follow-up paper by Hart, Roth, Ullman, Servetio, they were able to give some improvement in the worst case properties. So they were able to improve on additive noise in terms of the amount of data, but the algorithm doesn't improve at all in terms of running time. And there are kind of 2 points on this chart. So really we want to be here. And there are two interesting cases, two interesting starting points we need to get before we can actually get anywhere close to the bottom left. Okay, and the first is that there's no algorithm here that runs in that runs in sublinear time. All right, so if all I want to do is output the k-way disjunctions, I don't even need to write down all the queries. Maybe I can just quickly output a summary such that you can then quickly get an answer to the query you want. Okay, and so there's a hole here. There's nothing below this line. And in joint work with Thaler and Vadan, we were able to give the first algorithm that runs in sublinear time. Okay, so we improved the running time from d to the k, which is the number of queries, to about d to the root k, which is much less than the number of queries. Okay, the other thing you might notice is that if I really insist on having a small amount of data, and I think this is an important practical regime for the problem, there's just sort of no algorithm faster than private multiplicative weights. Okay, so if this is all the data I have, k root d records, we don't know how to do anything, even for this very special case, that's faster than private multiplicative weights. And what we showed in work from last year with Chandrasekhar and Thaler and Wan is that you can do something. So for k-way disjunctions, you can get a sub-exponential time algorithm. So the running time is exponential in something smaller than d. But it still gets nearly the optimal amount of data. It still requires only something that's very close to the limit of how much data you need. Okay, let me just say a little bit about what the techniques are that go into these results. So basically, using kind of standard techniques from learning theory, this was actually first observed by Hart, Rothblum, and Cervetio before my work on the problem. It's known that when you only care about k-way disjunctions, this function f sub d has an approximation by a low-degree polynomial. Okay, so I don't want to explain exactly what I mean by this, but if you represent the query in an appropriate way, you can compute the answer to the query via some low-degree polynomial. And in this work with Thaler and Vadan, what we showed is a fast, simple algorithm for releasing kind of a private version of the polynomial. So I release this polynomial, it's differentially private, and you evaluate it to get the answers to your queries. And I can do it in sublinear time. In this later work, what we showed is that you can improve the amount of data you need if you have a polynomial that's not only low degree, but also sparse. And here, what we needed was something a little bit different from what you need in typical learning settings. So we actually showed kind of new tight upper and lower bounds on the degrees that you can get for these sparse polynomials. And so this is another case where we had to sort of answer new questions that were not obviously related to differential privacy, but turn out to give us some nice algorithms for differential privacy. Okay, and then in all of these works, you need some algorithm for actually releasing a noisy version of the polynomial, and we show how to do that too. Okay, so if there are no questions about the results for disjunctions, I can just sort of conclude with what I think are the take-home points of this line of work. Okay, so I think sort of the take-home I want to give you is that, even though we have these hardness results for differential privacy, it seems that, we're just starting to really uncover the right techniques for getting computationally efficient algorithms for natural problems. So if you really focus on what is it you want to do with the data, what is the natural problem that you need to solve, then it opens up a lot of techniques that seem to give you more efficient algorithms. And I think there's real hope that we can get very efficient algorithms in terms of the amount of data you need and the running time. And so I haven't just been working on contingency tables or disjunction queries. I think these types of issues come up in a lot of settings. So I've done some work on other kind of natural data analysis tasks, like generating a synthetic graph. So you give me a graph where the edges are sensitive information, and I'll generate kind of a synthetic graph that approximately preserves the number of edges crossing any cut. Okay, so the number of edges between any two groups of friends. This was from work with Gupta and Roth, and there's been some nice follow-up work on this. Some of it by Mr. Orshefet over there. So also, if you want to solve, say, a linear program where the specification of your linear program is derived from sensitive data, in some recent work with Shu, Roughgarden, and Roth, we have some algorithms for solving such linear programs in a private way. Another problem that I think is interesting that's received a lot of attention is answering what are called empirical risk minimization queries. This is something that comes up a lot in machine learning and statistical estimation, and I've started to do some work on this problem. And I think just generally, when you really drill down on what the specific problem you want to solve is, and think hard about the problem, we're going to be able to get good differentially private algorithms for these problems. Okay, so let me just wrap up and tell you something about, directions where I think this work might go. So what I think are some of the next questions that I'd like to answer, and maybe, some of the people in this room would like to work on with me. So, as I sort of alluded to, there's lots of questions about, what is the complexity of answering simple queries. So we made some progress on it, but there are lots of questions that are still open, and I think we're just starting to really answer those questions. And again, so even though we seem to know the right answers for arbitrary statistical queries, what we don't know is, the place that you really want to get to is if you just tell me your favorite family of queries, I want to characterize how much data do I need to get accurate answers and how efficiently can I do it. And I think that what you'd really like is to be able to do this in sort of an automatic way for every family of queries. But in particular, I think that this k-way disjunction queries problem, we've seen that it's sort of been a good model for developing new techniques for differentially private algorithms, and I think it's one that we should continue to look at. And I'm very hopeful that eventually we'll get a genuinely polynomial time algorithm for this problem. So another question that I'm really interested in is, what's the relationship between lower bounds for differential privacy and kind of actual attacks on privacy that you can do in practice when somebody gives you a supposedly anonymized data set? All right, so as Andrew pointed out, when you use fingerprinting codes, what you get is a very particular kind of attack model. There's a very particular thing you're trying to do, which is, I already know a lot about you, and I'm trying to determine if you've entered this data set. And we've seen a very similar attack occur in practice. There's some work by Homer et al. Where they showed how to attack genomic data using a very similar algorithmic idea to the ones underlying fingerprinting codes. And this really happened. So this actually led to a takedown of genomics data by the NIH. And there's just a very interesting sort of theoretical relationship between fingerprinting codes and their attack. And I think understanding whether fingerprinting codes can be used to either make these attacks more powerful or whether we can actually show that these attacks can be mitigated in practice is important. And more generally, I think that just understanding algorithms for attacking release statistics is something that should be given more attention. So I think that it would be great to develop something kind of like cryptanalysis, something analogous to cryptanalysis, which has been so important in informing cryptography and security, that we can use to inform practical algorithms for differential privacy. All right, and the last thing I want to call attention to is a little bit different, which is how techniques from differential privacy can help us answer questions in other fields, so things that are not inherently about privacy. And one field where I think we've started to see this happen is mechanism design. So it's been known for a while, since kind of a very nice work of McSherry and Talwar, that there are certain conceptual connections between differential privacy and game theory. So in both areas, what you're really interested in is understanding what happens when one person kind of changes their data. All right, so in game theory, you want to understand, do they have incentives to change their data? In differential privacy, you kind of bound how much effect they can have on the output when they change their data. And by looking at this connection, it lets you say a lot of things about game theory, some of them about the connection between privacy and game theory. And what I've been interested in is whether it can say things about game theory that do not sort of obviously relate to privacy. So I have this paper from ITCS this year with Kearns, Pai, and Roth, where we talk about using techniques from differential privacy to get coordination mechanisms in large games. So trying to do things using the ideas from privacy that don't inherently pertain to privacy. And I think this is an interesting question that I'd like to sort of look more into is, what can techniques from differential privacy say about other problems? I think kind of the way that differential privacy deals with understanding noisy systems is a generally useful thing, and we've built up a lot of tools that I think can go do a lot of other things outside of privacy. Okay, so I will stop here, and thanks very much for listening. I would. Yeah?
So on the relationship to game theory, are those sorts of results as the number of players gets larger?
Yeah, so we were looking at settings where you have a large system, like a large routing game where some large number of people n want to get from point A to point B, and we look at how you can sort of get them to coordinate on use of the network, and in general, that sort of question. So generally, like as with privacy, where you can say a lot more when you have a lot of people in your data set, this sort of connection says a lot more when there's a lot more people in the game.
And is that because of the structure of the game starts to be that each individual player matters less?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if I have a game with lots of people, but n minus 2 of them are doing something irrelevant and we're fighting each other, it doesn't say as much. Just as if I have some query where there's n people in the data set, but the query is, what is your data? It doesn't help much. I think Merlin was first.
My question is, when you have these lower bounds, I assume they are all notation, right? So number of samples you need. I'm curious about the constants in those. I mean, are they small enough for start scoring to real-time DSI constants? Do you have any idea about the efficiency of those constants?
So that's a good question. So the constants in the optimal constructions of fingerprinting codes are a little bit loose because the analysis is somewhat tricky. And I'm sure they can be somewhat optimized, but you're definitely not going to get a lower bound that's tied up to constants. In fact, we don't even get a lower bound that's tied up to sort of polylogarithmic factors. I will say that the connection between fingerprinting codes and differential privacy in some sense goes both ways. So basically, if you really want to prove that you can actually get away with, not square root d, but square root d over 100 records for answering the attribute means, then you really need to show that the constants in the fingerprinting codes can't be improved. So generally, it seems to be more of a limitation in analysis. I think sort of conceptually, the message of fingerprinting codes is you can't do better than additive noise. I suspect, even up to constants. You're on? Thank you very much. Okay. Sure. Right. Okay, so what we show is that basically, no matter what algorithm you use to get differential privacy, I will be able to identify one person in the data set. Okay, and differential privacy says I should protect everyone in the data set, and I think there's good motivation for that. On the other hand, fingerprinting codes give you something very strong. They say no matter what algorithm you use, I will find one person in the data set. In particular, they were designed for the case where all n people could get together and just use one person's code word. And that's the best I could do. I can't find anyone else. On the other hand, if you look at, say, this Homer et al. Attack that people did in practice, they're not attacking kind of the worst case algorithm, right? What they did there was they just released a bunch of statistics. So in some sense, what they showed was that the data is in some sense a fingerprinting code. And for this very simple collusion where they just released the statistics, I can find lots of people. And I think there's lots of interesting things that you can do to try to refine this connection and understand, is real data a fingerprinting code? What algorithms prevent these attacks? I just think there's all kinds of things you could want to know about this. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Going back to part 2,
So I'm not quite sure what you mean by the variance.
You know, like the distance. So you get the mean, of course, from that, and then
Okay.
and then the average of the distance of the mean for each over each.
So for a single attribute, everything's just a bit. So kind of once I know the mean, I actually sort of know the variance of that attribute. What I think of sorry. No. Okay. So I think like the simplest example of what I can do with say a two-way disjunction is I can look at the correlation between two attributes. So if I know the mean of one attribute, the mean of another, that tells me if they're uncorrelated, then I know what fraction of people should answer, let's say 1 to both of those queries, and I can tell if the number of people who answered 1 to both of those queries is larger or smaller. So I can tell if they're correlated or not. Right. So then I only want to ask like one way. I mean, then there's only one-way disjunctions. So.
Okay, right. But then that one-way disjunction will not allow you variance. Is that right? So the variance of the empirical variance of the data.
Right. So the data is bits, right? So if I tell you that 80% of them are 1 and 20% are 0, you know both the mean and variance of the bits. Thanks, everyone.